Title: The Weight of a Challenge. Hong Kong, 1957. The air in the Yip Man Ving Tsun Martial Arts Academy was thick with the scent of sweat, liniment, and the faint tang of incense burning in the corner. The wooden floor creaked under the weight of 24 students, their eyes fixed on the center of the room where the Grandmaster, Yip Man, stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Among the crowd was a young man, barely 18, leaning against the wall with a restless energy that seemed to hum beneath his skin. Bruce Lee. He had been training under Yip Man for nearly 2 years, but unlike the others, he was not content with tradition. He questioned. He pushed. And sometimes, he challenged. That evening, the lesson had been on Chi Sa, the sticky hands drill that was the heart of Wing Chun. Yip Man had demonstrated a flawless sequence, his wrists flowing like water, redirecting force with effortless precision. When he finished, he turned to his students and said, "This is the essence of our art. Without Chi Sa, Wing Chun is just empty form." Bruce, never one to hold his tongue, smirked. "Respectfully, Sifu, if someone doesn't play by the rules of Chi Sa, if they just come at you with raw speed and power, what then?" A murmur rippled through the room. Some students shifted uncomfortably. Others grinned, eager to see how the Grandmaster would respond. Yip Man's gaze was steady, his voice calm. "Then they will find themselves on the ground before they even realize they've been struck." Bruce didn't back down. "Words are easy, Sifu. But if someone really came at you like that, someone strong, someone fast, could you stop them?" The room fell silent. Yip Man's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in assessment. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "Prove it." Bruce didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward, his stance shifting from Wing Chun's centerline to something looser, more dynamic, a hint of the style he would later refine into Jeet Kune Do. His right hand snapped out in a lightning-fast jab, not the controlled, measured strike of Chi Sa, but a real, committed attack. Yip Man moved. It was so fast that most of the students didn't even see it. One moment, Bruce was launching his strike, the next, he was on his back, the wind knocked out of him, staring up at the ceiling. Yip Man stood over him, his hand still extended in a palm strike that had stopped just short of Bruce's chest. The room erupted. Some gasped. Others laughed in disbelief. A few clapped, impressed by the Grandmaster's skill. Bruce, however, wasn't done. He sprang to his feet, his pride stinging more than his back. Again, he demanded. Yip Man sighed, but there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "You are persistent, little dragon. Very well." This time, Bruce didn't hold back. He came in with a flurry, a jab, a cross, a low kick, no Chi Sa, no adherence to Wing Chun's structure. Just raw, aggressive combat. Yip Man slipped, parried, and redirected each strike with minimal effort, his movements so precise that Bruce might as well have been swinging at air. Then, in a blink, Bruce was on the ground again. This time, he stayed down for a moment, breathing hard. The other students watched in awe. No one had ever seen anyone challenge Yip Man like this, and no one had ever seen the Grandmaster move so effortlessly. Bruce sat up, rubbing his shoulder. Then, with a grin, he said, "Okay. Maybe there's something to this Chi Sa after all." Yip Man extended a hand and helped him up. "You have talent, Bruce. But talent without control is like a wildfire, it burns everything in its path, including itself." Bruce nodded, the lesson sinking in. But as he looked around at the other students, some still whispering, others staring at him with newfound respect, he knew one thing for certain. He would never stop pushing. And one day, the world would see just how far that fire could burn. Epilogue: The Spark of a Legend. Years later, when Bruce Lee was already a rising star in Hong Kong cinema and martial arts, he would often tell this story to his own students. Not with pride, but with humility. "I thought I was fast," he'd say, shaking his head. "But Sifu Yip Man? He was faster. Not because he was stronger, but because he understood." That's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. And although Bruce would go on to revolutionize martial arts, to create his own philosophy and style, he never forgot the lesson of that day. True mastery isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about proving it to yourself, again and again. The end. The last lesson. The years following that morning in Yip Man's Kwon were marked by silent obsession. Bruce didn't stop training. He didn't stop questioning. And, above all, he continued to be humiliated by older masters, by more experienced opponents, even by his own limits. Each defeat was a mirror, and he learned to break it and rebuild it, sharper. Hong Kong was buzzing with the energy of young people seeking something beyond rigid traditions. Bruce, then in his early 20s, was already a controversial figure, an American-born Chinese man with a style that challenged orthodox Wing Chun, mixing what he had learned from Yip Man with Western boxing, fencing, dancing, anything that made him faster, more precise. His students adored him, traditional masters saw him as a threat. It was at a kung fu tournament in Kowloon that the conflict exploded. Bruce faced Wong Jackman, a fighter trained in classical Shaolin martial arts, known for his rigidity and disdain for Bruce's innovations. The fight was scheduled under the condition that if Bruce lost, he would abandon his hybrid style and return to pure teachings. If he won, he would have the right to teach as he pleased. The makeshift ring in a temple courtyard was surrounded by a tense crowd. Wong Jackman, tall and imposing, moved with the solemnity of someone carrying centuries of tradition in their fists. Bruce, smaller and more agile, danced around him like a restless shadow. The first blows were cautious, Wong testing Bruce's defense, Bruce dodging with movements that looked more like dancing than fighting. Then came the first serious attack. Wong threw a roundhouse kick that, if successful, would have broken ribs. Bruce blocked with his forearm, but the force of the blow made him retreat. The crowd murmured. Wong smiled confidently. "You're nothing more than a boy playing warrior," he said, in Cantonese. "Kung Fu is not a game." Bruce didn't respond. Instead, he closed his eyes for a second, just a second, and when he opened them, something in them had changed. It was the same calm he had seen in Yip Man years before, but now tempered by something wilder, more urgent. He attacked. Not with the perfect technique of a master, but with the controlled fury of someone who had spent years being crushed by their own limits. His fists were lightning, his feet barely touched the ground. Wong blocked, counterattacked, but Bruce was no longer there. He moved like water, like wind, adapting, flowing, never stopping. When Wong attempted a decisive blow, Bruce dodged and landed a side kick to his opponent's knee. The crack was audible. Wong fell. The crowd exploded. Some applauded, others shouted in protest. Wong stood up, limping, his face contorted in a mixture of pain and anger. "That's not kung fu," he growled. "That's cheating." Bruce wiped the sweat from his forehead, panting but smiling. "Kung fu is not a cage," he said. "It's a key. And I just opened the door." In the following years, Bruce Lee would become a legend. He founded Jeet Kune Do, a style that was not a style but a philosophy: absorb what is useful, discard what is useless, and add what is uniquely yours. He taught in Los Angeles, trained Hollywood stars, starred in films that changed martial arts cinema forever. But in his quieter moments, when the world wasn't looking, he still remembered that morning in Yip Man's Kwon. And sometimes, when a new student arrived full of arrogance, eager to prove his strength, Bruce made sure to be the first to knock him down. "Do you think you know how to fight?" he asked, as the young man stood up, confused. "Then prove it." "Not to me. To yourself." Because, in the end, that was what Yip Man had taught him, that the real fight was not against others, but against the illusion that one had already reached the end. That the fire that burned within him was not to be displayed, but to be fed in day after day, defeat after defeat, until there was nothing left but the flame. And when, in 1973, Bruce Lee collapsed, exhausted, in a Hong Kong apartment, his heart no longer able to take the pressure of a life lived on the edge, the world wept. But those who really knew him knew, he never stopped fighting. Not even in that last moment. The last breath of the flame. Bruce Lee's body collapsed onto the Persian rug in Betty Ting Pei's apartment, as if the very weight of existence had become unbearable. The air escaped his lungs in a hoarse sigh, and for a moment, there was only silence, that same silence that preceded every blow, every calculated movement, every time he challenged the limits of the possible. But now, there was nothing left to calculate. Just the end. The doctors arrived too late. The machines, the tubes, the panicked voices, everything became an indistinct blur, as if the world around him had dissolved into the fog of a fever dream. Bruce tried to speak, but the words were lost before they reached his lips. What would he have said? That there was still more to prove? That the fight didn't end there? Or that, deep down, he always knew that the greatest battle was not against others, but against his own body, that prison of flesh and blood that would one day, inevitably, betray him? Linda, his wife, arrived at the hospital with red eyes, her trembling fingers clutching the ring in her pocket. She had seen Bruce on the verge of collapse before, in the grueling training sessions, the sleepless nights writing scripts, the bouts of pain that left him hunched over like a wounded animal. But never like this. Never without a fight. When the doctors shook their heads in defeat, she didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just held his hand, cold and still, and whispered something that only the two of them understood. Outside, the world was already beginning to fall apart. News spread like wildfire: Bruce Lee is dead. The dragon is gone. Fans thronged the streets of Hong Kong, some in tears, some in denial, many simply standing still, as if the ground beneath their feet had disappeared. In cinemas, the lights went out for a minute of silence. In gyms, students stopped their training and knelt, touching their foreheads to the floor in respect. And in the dark alleys, where men gathered to bet on clandestine fights, there were those who raised a bottle of sake in his memory, because Bruce was not just a fighter. It was proof that limits were made to be broken. But not everyone cried. In an office in Kowloon, a man in a white suit and sunglasses hung up the phone with a cold smile. Finally, he thought. The ghost is gone. He wasn't the only one. In the shadows, there were those who breathed a sigh of relief at Bruce Lee's death, men who feared his influence, his ability to inspire, his refusal to bow. To them, Bruce was not an icon. It was a threat. And now, with him out of the way was clear. Meanwhile, in the small apartment where it all began, Yip Man lit incense and sat in front of an old photograph. In it, a young Bruce, still thin and bright-eyed, smiled with the confidence of someone who had not yet known defeat. The old master closed his eyes and muttered a prayer. Not for Bruce's soul, he knew his student had already transcended that. But for those who stayed. For those who still believed that the fight was only physical. For those who did not understand that true victory was not in never falling, but in getting up once again. And then, as if responding to a call, the wind came through the open window and extinguished the incense flame. The legacy that didn't die. The years passed. Unfinished films were released, hastily cobbled together with alternate scenes and stunt doubles. Books were written, conspiracy theories flourished, some said Bruce was poisoned, others that his death was a trick to escape fame. But the truth was simpler: his body couldn't handle the weight of a life lived at top speed. Like an overheated engine, it had burned until there was no more fuel left. And still, he kept fighting. Not with punches or kicks, but with something more powerful: memory. In Los Angeles, a boy named Brandon Lee grew up under his father's shadow. He tried to get away from Kung Fu, he tried to just be an actor, but genetics and destiny had other plans. In 1993, while filming The Crow, a defective bullet hit him on set. He died at 28, the same age as Bruce. Some said it was a coincidence. Others, that it was the price of carrying the Lee name. In Hong Kong, a woman named Shannon Lee, Bruce's youngest daughter, took over the family foundation and became the keeper of his legacy. she traveled the world, giving lectures on philosophy, martial arts, and the importance of living with purpose. My father wasn't a superhero, she said. He was a man. And that's exactly why he became a myth. And in the gyms, on the streets, in the hearts of those who never met him, Bruce lived on. Every time a fighter stepped into the ring and refused to give up. Every time an artist looked at a blank canvas and decided to create something new. Every time someone, somewhere looked in the mirror and asked themselves, how far can I go? It was Bruce's spirit that answered. Because, in the end, he never stopped fighting. Not even when the last breath left your lips. Not even when the world declared him dead. Because some flames don't go out. They just turn into something bigger. And his? His became eternal. The last round. Years later, in a working-class neighborhood in Hong Kong, a boy named Li Wei trained alone in a narrow alley, kicking the air with the clumsy precision of someone who had not yet mastered the technique. His father, a former Wing Chun fighter who had lost his leg in a factory accident, watched from the window of their tiny apartment, his eyes moist. He couldn't afford a gym membership, but he had an old VHS tape borrowed from a neighbor, Chinese Dragon, the film that had changed his life decades before. Fear is like a wall, the father murmured, repeating the words he had heard from Bruce Lee in an interview. Don't try to climb it. Break it. Li Wei stopped, panting. But how, father? How do you break a wall? The man smiled, sadly. You're already breaking. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, a woman named Elena Vasquez closed the doors of her martial arts studio for the last time. Rents had gone up, students had dwindled, and at 60, she no longer had the strength to compete with modern gyms, full of shiny equipment and promises of quick results. On the floor, among cardboard boxes, was a framed, autographed photo of Bruce Lee. She picked it up, brushing off the dust with her fingers. You taught me how to fight, she said, as if he could hear her. But it didn't teach me how to lose. It was then that the doorbell rang. At the door, a young woman in her early 20s, with short hair and a determined look, held a battered backpack. I heard that you are IP Man's last direct student, he said, bluntly. I want to learn real Wing Chun. Not what they sell out there. Elena laughed bitterly. And what makes you think I still have something to teach? The young woman opened her backpack and took out a worn notebook. In it, pages and pages of notes, movement diagrams, underlined sentences. Because I already know what you know, he said. But I need to know how you feel. Elena looked at Bruce's photo, then at the young woman. Then take off your shoes. And prepare to hurt. At a Seattle hospital, a neurosurgeon named Daniel Carter was removing the last screw from a patient's skull when his hand shook. It wasn't tiredness, it was something deeper, an old voice whispering in his mind, you're hiding. He finished the surgery, washed his hands and went to the locker room window. Outside, the rain beat against the gray buildings. Daniel was 38 years old, had a brilliant career, a wife who loved him and 2 children who barely saw him. And yet, there he was, feeling like a ghost. In the pocket of his coat, his cell phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Have you ever wondered why you chose medicine? Or did you just take the easy way out? Daniel frowned. There was no sender. The next day, when he left the hospital, he found an envelope stuck to the car door. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a Bruce Lee quote, "Life is better lived than conceptualized." And an address. The 3 never met. But in different ways, each of them was pulled back into the fight. Li Wei, at 18, won the National Kung Fu Championship with a style that mixed his father's Wing Chun and the explosion of Jeet Kune Do. When reporters asked where his motivation came from, he replied, "From a man I never met. But who taught me that weakness exists only in the mind?" Elena reopened her studio, now called The Last Dragon. It wasn't a gym, it was a sanctuary. There, she taught not just scams, but philosophy. The fight is not against others, he said. It's against the fear of being who you are. And Daniel? He sold his house in Seattle, bought a mobile clinic and began traveling the country, serving underserved communities. His wife supported him. His children, at first, didn't understand. But when they saw him save a child in a destitute village, they knew he had finally found his purpose. Years later, on a clear night, the three dreamed of the same man. Bruce Lee, young, standing in an empty ring, smiling. "You won," he said. But the fight never ends. And then, like smoke in the wind, it disappeared. The next day, Li Wei woke up and knew that he needed to open his own school. Elena received a letter from a former student, now a mother, thanking her for teaching her how to defend herself, not just from bullies, but from self-doubt. And Daniel, when operating on a patient without anesthesia because there was no other option, felt the same fire that had consumed him in his youth. Because some flames don't go out. They just wait for the right moment to burn again. The years passed, and the marks of that night became scars of pride. Li Wei built his school among the mountains, where the wind carried the sound of blows and laughter of children who learned more than techniques, they learned to get up. Elena, now with silver hair, wrote letters to her students around the world, each one an echo of her own journey. Daniel, with his hands steady despite his fatigue, operated in war hospitals, where pain and hope mixed in the air. And sometimes, when the sky darkened and the stars aligned as they had in the past, they found themselves in dreams. No longer pursued by shadows, but accompanied by the same serene smile, a reminder that the fight was not against something, but for everything that could still be saved. The flame never went out. It just spread.